Hello YouTube viewers, welcome to my show Computer Wednesday. In today's episode we're going to talk about the mania that is going on YouTube about AMD. So let's dive right into it. So you can't understand AMD without understanding Intel. So let's take a brief overview. You have to understand AMD is an old company. It was established in 1968. Now they, in terms of market share, in terms of what they own, in terms of x86, they are the granddaddy. Basically their worst day is like when their market share drops to 95%. Basically they are always above 90%. It's like Apple only, and there is nothing else. So it's not like Apple or Android, like there is a market share going back and forth. This is like only Apple and little bit of Android. So they are very big, they are old, they are big, and they technically don't have a true competitor which can fight against fight against them on their own level. Basically there are some 3 to 5 6 competitors, but they are all fighting in different arenas. Like in terms of memory production, Samsung beats it. In terms of RAM production, they gave up on that. So there are other things, but no one corporation that comes close to it. Now the reason why Intel is so big or so powerful is not that there were not companies before this. Like Motorola also used to make processor, they were like Sony also was trying to make a processor, IBM was also successful. So what happened, how the heck this company became so big? It's simply because of this basically 8086 system. Now if somebody gave you this processor today, you simply won't be able to use it. Basically this was ancient processor, but if you ask anyone who does computer engineer or anything like that, it's like this is the foundation. Basically our current processor design on every system like there is on this planet is basically directly derived from this laid the foundation of IT infrastructure. So importance of this cannot be understated. Like this basically propelled humanity into information era. So this was a golden goose, and basically Intel is like milking a lot of it. So at this point in time, the conventional wisdom is basically if you are poor, you buy something else. If you are rich and if you can afford it, you buy i9, basically, simply because there is nothing else that can outcompete this. So this is Intel, the big daddy. So did Intel ever lost? Well, yes. The first loss happened to Intel was because of their own architecture. The architecture they created that made them so successful was a sys architecture. Basically it's a complex instruction set. Now benefit of sys, it requires less memory, basically less cache memory, less RAM. Now when they started like around 1980s, you have to understand RAM processors were like ludicrously expensive, like 16k of RAM. Like I'm not even talking megabyte, kilobytes. So in those days that was like a mind-bogglingly amazing feat. However, as time progressed, sys started to make less and less sense, simply because it was inherently inefficient, inherently so there was another architecture that was happening before sys happened. Before that was called RISC architecture. Now it slowly started to make a comeback simply because RAM prices, memory prices has started to come down. Heck, at this point in time you can literally buy processors that are like that has like around 10 to 20 megabytes of RAM in them, like a cache memory in them. So the idea of like complex instructions started to fade out. So Intel did something interesting. They created sys plus hybrid architecture. So this was like taking the advantage of RISC and sys. So this is why they failed in smartphone industry, because smartphone needed RISC, because in smartphone you want everything to be as efficient as possible. So how sys plus hybrid was doing is basically they are taking complex instructions, making it into simple one, and then running it through the processor. Side effect, it consumes power. So flat out your instruction that is coming from your program or whatever have you comes in is like gets crunched and then you spits out a simple RISC architecture. Now that created a problem. That is why when you had Intel making mobile processor like Lenovo phones, Asus phone, XLO phones, there were many companies that wanted to see who wins out, and then these companies thought like, okay, it's Intel's gonna win, but Intel lost simply because of that blunt force instrument that they were using, that were like, okay, we'll use this system only small size, basically we're gonna make a small processor. It did not work out. And during this time Qualcomm started a architecture known as ARM architecture. No, Qualcomm did not start it. Basically ARM architecture existed, and because ARM was like more closer to RISC, there is no like absolute here. So do not think like, okay, RISC or versus sys. It's like everybody has a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Now the sys is very popular simply because it's easy to code for. So they had like bit of that, but ARM was completely different. It was like designed thoroughly, and it was very good for low power application like mobile phone. So flat out, this is the first time Intel truly lost. They pulled back. Basically the manufacturing division that was creating this sort of process, they closed down. Like okay, this is the first time Intel lost. Did it affect their bottom line? Short answer, no. They were that big. Like this is the first time Intel lost. Now That was the first loss. You also have to understand, while Intel was going on, there was this another company known as Advanced Micro Device. Now this is also old. It also was founded in May 1, 1969. The reason for this foundation was very interesting. Think of it this way: when you are making a processor, you're not making everything. Like Intel process, it only makes processor. Somebody else has to make the motherboard. Somebody else has to buy the product. So many companies were not very tuned by the idea of this quote unquote startup. Yes, Intel was a startup back in that days, so they were not thrilled by the idea like, okay, if I'm making product, whatever it may be, like, let's say a large supercomputer or mainframe computer or avionics or whatever have you, how can I be sure that this will be there? So they created this idea, let's create another company, AMD. And AMD and Intel came together. They created what we call full cross licensing in 1976. So the idea was Intel can, if Intel goes down, AMD can keep making the system. So Intel and AMD both can manufacture x86 architecture based processors. So there won't be a single point of failure. So if, let's say, for some reason AMD went under, you have Intel. If some reason Intel went under, you still have AMD. So people actually started to use it. Okay, like, okay, now we are far more confident when using it. Now you have to understand it. Even though AMD is as old as Intel, even though it started almost the same architecture, also the market share they have, it is very small. Like, it's laughable in terms of simple context. It will be a good day for them if they reach 5%, like 4 to 5%. If they reach that, that will be a very good day for them. So they have very basically small market share. And in terms of technology, they are behind. Basically the idea of the AMD's reputation is very simple: you are poor, you buy AMD. That's it, like flat out, that's it. Even though AMD makes everything from like server grade processor to workstation graphics card to workstation processors to low end basically processors for laptops or ultrabooks, nobody buys them. Like, in terms of actual use, they are flat out destroyed by Intel. However, something changed. Like, this company changed. Now that change is the reason why entire YouTube is being flooded by AMD. Is basically AMD was doing something in the background which Intel did not took seriously. The thing you have to understand, when a company generally loses, they try to gain back the system. Intel flat out abandoned their mobile architecture. Consequence of that, their research into advanced nanometer processor. Basically, they want to make the die as smaller as possible, die shrink as we call it. So they were like around 14 nanometer, then they went to 20 nanometer, then they went to basically 14 nanometer. They wanted to go to as low as 10 nanometer. They kind of slowed down that process because mobile was forcing it. Mobile companies were forcing, like, okay, let's make as small as possible, because power consumption is a big deal for mobile, but for computer you don't think too much about it. So in those sort of scenarios, Intel kind of slowed down their manufacture, and because there was no competition, they never actually processed anything. Like, their hardware brick by brick became like, okay, it's just a little bit better, just a little better, and the price they keep increasing it up because there was no competition. So from 2010 to like 2018, they were like, okay, Intel is the only option. Like, you can't build a supercomputer on the AMD. So this was the reality. However, AMD was working in the behind, and they were like, okay, let's make a processor. The first time they created something that was basically unique or interesting was Bulldozer FX8350. I have that. Now, it's not a good processor. Flat out, it's not a good processor. But this was the foundation of AMD. AMD started experimenting new because they were desperate. They started experimenting, and they came up with this idea: rather than making one badass processor, let's make small processors and then just glue them together into a big chip. So the idea worked. The AMD FX350 was the result of that, but it was a poor problem because you have to still optimize everything. There were a lot of other things, and it was very power hungry. So this gave the idea that AMD is basically for room heaters. If you are living in cold slab area, just buy AMD. You don't need room heater for that. And it was true. The power consumption was ludicrously high. But brick by brick, they learned how to get that chiplet design done. After that, they started to create Ryzen lineup, and this time they shrunk the die. They directly leapfrogged Intel. Intel was stuck at 14. They directly leapfrogged to 10. So understand, Intel is here, they jumped it here. Now again, because Intel has such a large people supporting it, like in terms of driver manufacturers, in terms of third-party manufacturers, in terms of everybody else supporting them, their processor was still more powerful. But AMD learned something new. Now they learned the chiplet architecture. Now they have also learned the basically small die shrink system, and they are like, okay, let's do everything again. Now they have shrunk the die also. They have in chiplet design, they have manufactured it, and now they have created what we call Ryzen 3000. Now this 3000 changes the game because every processor requires what we call a chipset to work properly. So the chipset AMD has released is basically X570. Now this changes the game because the conventional wisdom is very, you want a new technology, you buy Intel. But at this point in time, AMD is like, hold my beer. Basically, if you buy these processor, AMD motherboard, you will be only capable of running PCI 4.0. Think of it this way: you can't run this on basically Intel system. Now, of course, you can still buy this, connect it, and it will still work, but it will work at 2 GB per second. You want to get 4 GB out of this, you have to use PCI 4.0. AMD became the first company to introduce 4.0 to consumer electronics. 5.0 already exists in supercomputers and all that, but it's not for consumer. AMD became the first that brought it down to consumer. So at this point in time, if you really want to utilize these hardware, the cutting edge of the hardware technology, you have to have AMD. Like that changes the whole paradigm, because just before this PCI jump, we had another jump from PCI 2.0 to PCI 3.0. Intel was ahead. Then we had another jump from PCI 3 DDR 3.0 to DDR 4.0. Again, AMD was ahead. I'm saying Intel was ahead. So Intel was always ahead. Like that was always a given. AMD will be always ahead. But this Intel would be always ahead. This time it changed. Like at this point in time, if you want the latest and greatest, you have to buy AMD. This changed the whole dynamic. This architecture X570 changed everything. And in terms of the processor, because they were always looked upon as like poor people processor, they kept their price system. Basically, their processor, even though they can directly compete against Intel's offering, Intel is charging $1,000 and they are charging $600. They are like, okay, like just buy our cheap hardware. So brick by brick, because they learned the chiplet design, they learned the die shrink, brick by brick their performance started to catch up. Now first thing that first sign, like there is a issue with Intel, is that Intel had a lot of security flaws. You must have heard of Spectre and all that. So the multi-threading processing of the basically Intel department was bad. It was just bad. They were not utilizing multi-threading properly. But AMD, because they had to learn it the hard way, they kept fixing, and basically during Ryzen 2, basically 2000 series, they already at a point where if you want to do multitasking, basically if you are doing video encoding, you are doing number crunching or things of that nature, you had to get AMD, simply because AMD was better at multi-threading and it was cheaper. So it made sense for a lot of professionals to get into AMD system. However, there was still a scenario where Intel's single thread was still ahead. This time that changed. The single thread is almost at the same level. Almost, like it's like literally neck and neck. At this point in time, there is what we call margin of error. So that in AMD reached to that point. Now, is Intel better? Yes. Now, is Intel really better in day-to-day use? No, it's bad actually, simply because there is a lot of other advancement that happened. So during Ryzen 2000 series, they were like already ahead. Ryzen 2000 was already ahead compared to Intel. There was like already, if you want to do anything other than gaming in your system, you have to buy AMD, because AMD was utilizing much more of its core properly. And like there was a giant gap between performance, 30% performance gap. Now that gap is like upwards touching almost 50%. And in terms of price, the gap is like 2 times. Like if you want to buy something that can compete against, like let's say 3900X, like a $500 processor, you have to buy something $800. So understand this, like flat out, brick by brick they learned, brick by brick they build the foundation of the system, and so many people started to support them. This is the first time like AMD is getting such a large support. MSI is building, Gigabyte is building, every company is supporting them. And this time laptop manufacturers started to come towards them, because they have done the die shrinking. They are like in terms of teraflop per watt, they are ahead of Intel. So at this point in time, if they keep doing this, they will literally remove basically processor from Intel processor from laptops, because laptop is a complete device. You would never upgrade the processor of a laptop, and laptops people are keep buying it. So it's not like a desktop where people are doing any changes, and desktop lasts for 5 years. Laptop has a much smaller life cycle. So laptops, if this keeps going on, literally in 2 to 3 years time, and if Intel does not have a good answer to this, you will have a scenario where all your laptops will be AMD. So this is what happened, like this big milestone change that happened, like venting from like, okay, poor people computer to like, holy damn, you brought PCI 4 to public before Intel did that. And like your processor is much more better at multi-threading than Intel. You have much more cores than Intel. You have almost same performance as Intel. So at this point in time, the game has changed. Intel really has to do something innovative to fight against this, because some people say, what if Intel drops the price? Here's the deal, they will drop the price, the single okay, let's say drop the price, but they are still behind in multi-threading. They are flat out behind in multi-threading, flat out. There is no even competition there, so they can't just drop the price. And the people who want to show off their computer, they want luxurious things, so they were like, okay, I bought Intel because I can afford it. It's like iPhone, you can't reduce the iPhone price, nobody will buy it. So that is why the internet is like bombarded by AMD right now, because AMD did something very mind-boggling. Basically, patience has its own rewards. Like their patient paid off. The fact that they tried 8 cores into desktop, everybody laughed at it. It's like poor performance, 8 core, who wants it? But brick by brick, day by day, they reached a point where now they can actually flat out stand next to Intel and be like, dude, you don't have the latest and greatest technology. So this is why whole YouTube is blowing up with AMD. So this was my presentation on AMD mania that is going around. I hope you liked it, learn from it. In that case, please leave a like. If you didn't like it or didn't enjoy it, I would urge you to click dislike. If you want to really show me your disappointment, I would urge you to click it twice to show me your extra disappointment. And please leave a comment because I reply to all of them. Check out all these other videos and please subscribe. Press the bell icon if you're free. And as always, thanks for watching.